My name is Margaret Sullivan, and the sound of laughter still stings in my ears. It wasn't the laughter of joy, it was the kind that slices you open, the kind that lingers in a quiet kitchen long after everyone has gone home. That day, my mother-in-law looked at me, her voice as sharp as the crack of a whip. "Your pants are torn." The room fell silent for half a second, then burst into chuckles. Evelyn's friends laughed. Even my husband smiled awkwardly, pretending not to notice the pain on my face. And then, my little niece, 8 years old and innocent, pointed with a giggle. "Grandma, she really did rip her pants." The sound of that child's laughter broke something inside me. I could feel my cheeks burning, but I kept smiling, holding a tray of iced tea that suddenly felt too heavy for my trembling hands. When one glass slipped and shattered on the kitchen tile, the crash was louder than all their laughter. That was the day I realized silence could hurt more than words. Later that night, after everyone had gone, I sat in my small corner of the house, the only space that felt like mine, and folded the torn pants. They were old, soft, comfortable. I had worn them for years while gardening, painting, living an honest life. But to Evelyn, they were a symbol of everything she despised about me, plain, unpolished, unworthy of her son. I placed them in the bottom drawer beneath old photo albums, as if hiding my shame could erase it. Tom came into the room, smelling faintly of his mother's perfume. She hugged him longer than she should have that evening. He saw me sitting there and said softly, "Don't take it to heart, Maggie. Mom just speaks her mind." I smiled, but my throat burned. She's been speaking her mind for 10 years, Tom. Maybe it's time someone spoke back. He looked uncomfortable. "Just let it go. You know how she is." I did know how she was, and that was the problem. Evelyn had lived with us since Tom's father passed. At first, I tried to welcome her. I thought we could be family, maybe even friends. But from the moment she moved in, the air in our home changed. The kitchen that once smelled of cinnamon and fresh coffee now smelled like her expensive floral soap. She rearranged my spice rack, replaced my curtains, criticized the way I folded laundry. Once I overheard her whisper to a neighbor on the porch. I told Tom he could have done better. "She's kind, but so plain." I wanted to pretend it didn't hurt, but the truth is, it did. Every word chipped away at me, slow and steady, like water eroding stone. I tried harder. I cooked her favorite meals, ironed her clothes, remembered her medication. Nothing was ever enough. She would find fault in everything, too salty, too dark, too simple. Even the flowers I planted out front, she said, made the house look cheap. It wasn't until that Sunday, the day of the torn pants, that something inside me finally cracked. The next morning, Evelyn acted as if nothing had happened. She hummed in the kitchen while reading her church bulletin. When I walked in, she smiled sweetly, the kind of smile that hides a knife behind it. "Don't worry, dear. We've all had our embarrassing moments. Maybe next time wear something more dignified." Her tone was sugar-coated venom. I didn't answer. I simply turned back to the sink and kept washing dishes. The sound of water running drowned out her voice, but it couldn't drown out the thoughts in my head. How did I end up like this? When did I become the woman who apologizes for existing? That night, I opened the drawer and took out the torn pants again. I traced the frayed edges with my fingertips, feeling every stitch, every worn fiber, like touching a wound that never healed. And then, for the first time, I whispered to myself, "This isn't who I was meant to be." I didn't know it then, but that small whisper was the beginning of something powerful. Not anger, not revenge. It was the birth of resolve, quiet, patient, and unyielding. The days that followed felt colder. Evelyn seemed to sense my silence changing. She no longer saw me as invisible. She saw me as dangerous a woman who might one day stop bending. And she was right. When Tom went to bed that evening, I stayed up alone, sitting by the window, staring at the moonlit garden. The old oak tree outside rustled in the wind, its branches scarred but still standing tall. I remember thinking, that's me now, scarred but not broken. As I folded those pants one last time, I didn't hide them at the bottom anymore. I placed them neatly on top of the drawer in plain sight. Not as a reminder of shame, but as proof that I was still here. And that one day Evelyn would know what it felt like to wear them. Evelyn never needed to raise her voice to make me feel small. Her power came from the quiet precision of her criticism, the way she could turn an ordinary breakfast into a trial of character. If the eggs were too soft, I was careless. If they were too firm, I was trying too hard. No matter what I did, she found a way to turn my effort into evidence against me. Tom called it just her way. He said she'd always been a perfectionist. But what he called perfection, I called cruelty in a cardigan. It was early December when I realized Evelyn's influence had spread beyond our walls. At church, I overheard two women whispering near the coffee table. Their tone was polite, but their eyes flickered toward me as one said, "Well, she tries her best." The other replied, "Bless her heart. It must be hard living under Evelyn's standards." I smiled and passed them a plate of cookies, pretending I didn't hear. Pretending had become my second nature. That evening, I found a stack of envelopes on the kitchen counter, unpaid utility bills. Evelyn handled the finances ever since she moved in, claiming Tom wasn't organized enough. When I mentioned it, she snapped, "If you want to take over, dear, by all means. Let's see how long before the lights go out." Tom stepped in before I could answer, placing a hand on my shoulder. "Don't, Maggie. Please." His voice wasn't firm, it was pleading. The tone of a man too afraid of peace breaking. I went to bed with my stomach twisted into knots, thinking of how easily silence had become the glue of our marriage. A few weeks later, something changed. I met Mrs. Green, our new neighbor, a retired schoolteacher in her late 60s, with silver hair and eyes that noticed everything, but judged nothing. She waved at me one morning while I was bringing in groceries. When she saw my hands full, she hurried over to help. Inside the kitchen, she glanced around, noting the tidy counters and spotless dishes. "You keep a beautiful home," she said softly. I smiled out of habit. "Thank you. My mother-in-law likes it that way." She looked at me for a moment longer than comfortable and said, "Honey, don't let someone else's taste erase your own." Those words stayed with me. Evelyn didn't like Mrs. Green. "She's too nosy," she muttered one night. "Women who live alone get strange ideas." But I liked her precisely because she wasn't afraid to have ideas. She invited me over for tea the following week. Her home was warm and cluttered books on every surface, mismatched curtains, laughter in the walls. It was the kind of mess that felt like freedom. Over lemon cake, she asked me quietly, "Do you ever take time for yourself?" I hesitated. "I don't really have time." "Then make it," she said. "Time doesn't appear, you carve it out." I drove home that evening with her words echoing louder than any insult Evelyn had ever thrown at me. That night, Evelyn was sitting in the living room watching an old drama on TV. She looked up as I walked in, then down at my clothes, jeans, sweater boots still dusty from Mrs. Green's walkway. "You've been out," she said flatly. "Yes," I replied. "Having tea with Mrs. Green." Her eyes narrowed. "It's nearly 7. You left the roast in the oven too long." I checked it wasn't burned just crisp at the edges. "Still," she sighed theatrically. "I suppose we'll eat it anyway." I sat down without a word. For the first time, I didn't rush to apologize. That small silence, deliberate, unyielding, startled her more than shouting ever could. A few days later, Tom mentioned my new friendship. "Mom says Mrs. Green's been giving you advice," he said. Cautiously. I smiled. "She listens. That's all." Tom frowned. "Just be careful. You know how Mom gets when she feels left out." I laughed softly. "Tom, your mother is never left out of anything." He didn't answer. He just sighed, and for a fleeting second I saw a boy who had never learned to stand up to the woman who raised him. As winter deepened, the walls of our home seemed to close in. Evelyn's health started to falter. Small things at first. Forgetting names, losing her balance, repeating stories. But even weakened, her pride stood tall. She refused help, snapping, "I'm not a burden." Yet she leaned on me more than she realized. I was the one who picked up her prescriptions, cleaned her spills, reminded her to take her pills. One evening after she went to bed, Tom came to me with tired eyes. "I don't know how you do it," he said. "She's so hard on you and you're still kind." I wanted to tell him kindness wasn't the same as weakness. Instead, I said, "Someone in this house has to keep peace." But inside, I felt something shifting, a quiet strength growing like roots deep beneath frozen soil. By January, the torn pants had been in the drawer for months. One night, I took them out again and ran my fingers along the seam. The fabric felt rough, but the edges were clean, ready to be mended. I threaded a needle under the yellow light of my bedside lamp. Each stitch was deliberate, slow, steady, a small act of defiance Evelyn would never see. With every pull of the thread, I whispered to myself, "You can't tear what's already healing." When I finished, I folded the pants neatly and placed them on the chair beside my bed. They looked stronger than before, imperfect, yes, but whole again. So was I. The first day I stepped into the library, I felt like I had entered another world. It smelled of dust paper and quiet, a peace I hadn't known in years. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead, and the woman at the front desk, Janet, with kind eyes and gray hair pulled into a bun, smiled as if she'd been waiting for me. "You must be Margaret," she said, glancing at the volunteer form I'd filled out. "We're grateful for the help. It gets busy around here when the school's let out." Busy was fine. Busy meant less time thinking. Busy meant I could breathe without someone watching every move. Evelyn didn't like my decision. When I told her over breakfast that I'd accepted a part-time job at the local library, she nearly dropped her teacup. "You," working her tone, turned from disbelief to disdain in a single breath. "At your age, I thought it might be good for me," I said gently. "Something to do." She set the cup down a little too hard. Women who work in their 50s usually have to, not because they want to. Tom shifted in his chair, buttering his toast. "Mom, it's just a few hours a week." She ignored him. "If you need money, you could just ask." "I don't," I said, and meant it. "I just want to feel useful." Evelyn gave a cold laugh. "You already are. You cook clean and keep this house running. That's usefulness enough." I looked her in the eye for the first time in weeks. Maybe I want to be useful for myself this time. Her fork froze midair. For a moment, I thought she might drop it or throw it. Instead, she smiled that thin, poisonous smile and said, "We'll see how long that lasts." At the library, time moved differently. There were no raised voices, no insults tucked into compliments. Just the soft shuffle of books, the low murmur of students, and the calm rhythm of pages turning. Janet introduced me to the others. Mark, a retired mail carrier who shelved biographies and always smelled faintly of peppermint. Anna, a college student who spent half her shift reading romance novels behind the counter. They were gentle souls people who listened without needing to fix anything. When I told them I hadn't worked in years, Janet smiled. Doesn't matter. Everyone has a story. Libraries are full of second chances. Her words felt like a quiet blessing. One evening, I stayed late after closing stacking returned books. Outside, snow drifted down beneath the yellow glow of a street lamp. It reminded me of the nights I used to dream before life narrowed into routine and caution. When I got home, Evelyn was sitting in her armchair, eyes sharp. "You're late," she said. "I stayed to help close up." She raised a brow. "For free, it's volunteer work?" "Yes." She scoffed. "Imagine that working for nothing. You must be desperate for attention." I hung my coat and answered softly. "Maybe I just enjoy being treated with respect." The silence that followed was thick, heavy. Even Tom said nothing. Weeks passed, and for the first time in years, I started sleeping through the night. My hands didn't shake when I poured coffee. I found myself humming along with the radio while folding laundry. One afternoon, Mrs. Green came by the library and spotted me through the window. She waved, beaming, and when I stepped outside, she said, "I knew it, dear. There's life in you yet." I laughed. "You make it sound like I'd been buried." She winked. "Sometimes we are just under the wrong house." Evelyn's disapproval only grew. When Tom tried to defend me, she turned on him. "You're letting your wife run wild. A woman her age doesn't need new friends or new ideas. She needs to focus on her husband." Tom rubbed his forehead, weary. "Mom, she's not a child," she hissed. "Then she should stop acting like one." That night, as I lay in bed, Tom said quietly, "I'm sorry." She's set in her ways. I looked at him and whispered, "So am I." He didn't understand what that meant yet, but I did. A month later, the library offered me a small paycheck. "You've earned it," Janet said. I took it home and tucked it into an envelope in my dresser, right beside the mended pants. It wasn't about money. It was about freedom. Every stitch, every dollar, every page shelved, they all added up to something Evelyn couldn't touch: self-respect. Then one afternoon, something small but unforgettable happened. Evelyn was in the living room with her bridge friends. I walked in wearing the same mended pants pressed clean neat. She froze mid-sentence. Her friends smiled politely, but I could feel her eyes tracing every thread. "Margaret," she said, her voice honey-sweet. "I see you've kept those old things." I smiled back. "Yes, ma'am. I fixed them. They're stronger now." One of her friends chuckled. "Good for you. Waste not, want not." Evelyn forced a smile, but her knuckles whitened around her teacup. That was the first day she looked at me and realized I was no longer the woman she could shame. Later that night, I found her standing in the kitchen staring out the window. She didn't hear me at first. Then she said softly, "You think you've changed, don't you?" I paused. "I don't think so, Evelyn. I know I have." Her reflection in the glass didn't move. For the first time, I saw something in her eyes that looked a lot like fear. By spring, the world outside began to thaw, and so did something inside me. The trees lining Maple Street bloomed early that year, their pale blossoms scattering across the sidewalks like little scraps of forgiveness. I would walk home from the library each evening, the sun warm on my face, and think maybe I'm not invisible anymore. At work, Janet asked if I'd consider leading a small reading circle for older women in the community. She said, "You've got a calm voice, Margaret. People listen to you." I hesitated. Me. The woman who'd spent half her life being talked over. But something in her confidence made me say yes. We met every Thursday evening in the back corner of the library. 5 women, some widowed, some divorced, all carrying stories that never got told at their dinner tables. They came to read poems, essays, and sometimes just to cry. When they did, I listened. And for the first time, I didn't feel weak for understanding pain. Evelyn didn't like my little club. She called it a pity party for lonely women. One night at dinner, she said, "You're wasting time on people who dwell on their troubles. You can't fix anyone's life, Margaret." I looked up from my plate and said, "Maybe not. But sometimes listening is enough." Tom tried to change the subject, but the air stayed tense. Later, as we washed dishes, he whispered, "You really shouldn't argue with her. She's getting older." I dried my hands slowly. "So am I, Tom. And I'm not getting any braver by staying quiet." 2 weeks later, Evelyn's health slipped again. Her hands trembled, her balance faltered, but her pride remained steady as ever. When I offered to drive her to her doctor's appointment, she refused. "I can manage," she said, clutching her purse like a weapon. She didn't manage. She fell that afternoon, nothing broken, just a bruised knee and pride. When I found her sitting on the porch steps, she looked smaller than I'd ever seen her. I helped her up, gently brushing dust from her sleeve. "You're hurt," I said. "I'm fine," she snapped. But her voice cracked, and for the briefest second, she looked afraid. That night, she said nothing during dinner. Neither did I. The next morning, I found her sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold. Without looking up, she said, "You made the right call yesterday." I blinked. "What call?" "Helping me," she muttered. "Most people would have left me there." I wanted to say, "You're my family, Evelyn," but the words caught in my throat. I wasn't sure they were true anymore. Instead, I said softly, "Everyone falls, Evelyn. What matters is whether you let someone help you stand back up." She didn't answer, but her eyes shimmered faintly before she turned away. As her health declined, I became her caretaker in ways neither of us acknowledged. I cooked her meals, managed her medications, made her tea the way she liked, hot, strong with lemon. Every act of care was an act of quiet revenge, though not the kind Evelyn would understand. It wasn't about getting even. It was about proving to myself that kindness could survive cruelty. One evening, she called me into her room. "Margaret," she said, "I need you to help me with my stockings." It startled me. She had never asked for help with something so personal. As I knelt to assist her, she muttered, "I hate feeling useless." I said, "You're not useless, you're just tired." Her eyes filled with tears she refused to shed. In that moment, I didn't see a monster. I saw a woman trapped inside her own pride. At the library, my reading circle grew. Women began bringing their daughters, nieces, even neighbors. We started calling it the Life Stories Circle. We didn't read about heroes or saints, we read about ordinary people surviving ordinary cruelties. Sometimes I would tell bits of my own story carefully without names, and I could see recognition flicker across their faces. One woman said I stayed married to a man who never once said sorry. Another whispered, "My daughter thinks I'm weak for forgiving her father." I told them, forgiveness isn't weakness. It's reclaiming the space someone took from you. Their eyes filled, and I realized I wasn't just healing myself anymore. One night I came home later than usual. Tom was waiting in the living room. "She said you're changing," he murmured. "That you're different lately." I smiled gently. "Maybe I am." He hesitated, then added, "She's scared of it." I looked at him for a long moment. So was I. By June, Evelyn rarely left her room. I kept bringing her meals, checking in, but she no longer had the energy to fight. The silence between us changed, less tense, more hollow, like two women standing at opposite ends of the same empty bridge. One evening, while folding laundry, I found the mended pants again. The fabric was soft now, worn smooth by time. I held them up to the light, tracing the stitches I'd sewn months earlier. They were uneven, imperfect, but strong. I thought about how many times Evelyn had torn me down, how many times I'd stitched myself back together. The pants weren't just clothing anymore. They were a map of pain, patience, and power. I hung them neatly over the chair, smiling at the quiet symbolism of it all. For once, I didn't feel small in my own house. I didn't need Evelyn's approval, Tom's defense, or anyone's permission to exist as I was. I had become something she could never control, a woman who no longer needed to prove her worth. And somewhere deep down, I think she knew it. The morning the confrontation finally happened, the sky was heavy with rain. It wasn't dramatic thunder or lightning, just a soft, steady drizzle that made everything look washed out, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I was in the laundry room folding towels when I heard her voice, frail but sharp. "Margaret," Evelyn called. "Come here a moment." Her tone carried that old authority, the one that used to make me stop mid-step. But this time, I finished folding the last towel before I answered. When I stepped into her room, she was sitting on the edge of the bed, holding something in her hands. It took me a second to recognize it: the pants. My mended pants. "Still keeping these?" she asked. Her voice had that familiar twist of amusement, brittle and cruel. I stood in the doorway. "Yes." She looked at the stitches, ran a finger along the seams, and said, "Still ugly." Then with a bitter chuckle, "You could have just thrown them away, you know, like most people do when something's torn beyond repair." I walked closer, slow and calm. "Some things aren't meant to be thrown away," I said softly. "They remind us where we've been." Evelyn looked up at me, the corner of her mouth twitching. "You think you've learned something, don't you?" "I have," I said. "I've learned how to mend things even when the people who tore them never say sorry." For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she laughed again, though it sounded less like laughter and more like coughing. "You think you've healed, but you're still that same woman trying to prove herself." I felt the heat rise in my chest, but I didn't raise my voice. Instead, I reached out and gently took the pants from her hands. I held them up the fabric, trembling slightly in the light. "Do you know what these are, Evelyn?" I asked. She rolled her eyes. "A pair of cheap pants." I shook my head. "No. They're every time you made me feel small, every insult you dressed up as advice, every moment you made me question my worth. And you know what? I fixed them. I made them whole again." Evelyn stared at me, silent. Then I said it, the words that had been burning inside me for years. "Put them on and feel my pain." The room went still. The rain tapped gently against the window, the only sound between us. Evelyn blinked, confusion flickering into realization. Her hands, trembling, rested on her lap. For once, she didn't have a comeback. I turned to leave, but she spoke again, her voice quiet and broken. "I never meant to hurt you like that." I paused in the doorway. "Yes, you did," I said simply, "but it doesn't matter now. I'm not what you made me." She looked away, her eyes glistening. "You sound just like my mother," she whispered. There was pain in her tone, real, raw pain. And for the first time, I understood that cruelty doesn't grow in a vacuum. It's inherited, passed down like an heirloom no one wants, but no one knows how to throw away. I didn't forgive her then, not yet. But I saw her differently. Not as the villain of my story, but as a woman too afraid to face her own torn seams. That night, Tom found me sitting in the living room, the pants folded neatly on my lap. He looked uncertain, as if he'd walked into a room halfway through a confession. "Mom said you two talked," he said cautiously. I nodded. "She cried. I know. He sat beside me, rubbing his hands together. Margaret, I'm sorry. For all the times I didn't say anything, his voice cracked a little. I thought keeping peace was love. I looked at him gently. Sometimes love needs a little noise, Tom. He laughed under his breath. Guess we both learned something. In the weeks that followed, Evelyn softened in small ways. Not apologies, she was too proud for that, but gestures. One morning, she complimented my cooking. Another, she asked how work was at the library. It wasn't much, but it was a start. One evening, while setting the table, I heard her in the next room talking to Tom. She said she's stronger than I ever gave her credit for. He replied, she always was. And in that simple exchange, something heavy inside me finally lifted. Spring faded into early summer. Evelyn's health continued to decline, but the bitterness that once filled the house began to fade too. Sometimes we'd sit in silence together, not the tense silence of resentment, but the quiet kind that comes from exhaustion and peace. I kept the mended pants in a drawer, not hidden anymore, but kept like a photograph, a reminder, not a wound. They were proof that I could take something torn and make it stronger than before. And maybe in her own way, Evelyn was learning to do the same. Evelyn's decline came quietly, like dusk fading into night. One day she was walking through the garden, clutching her cardigan and complaining about the squirrels. A week later, she was too weak to make it to the porch. The woman who once ruled our home with precision and pride now moved carefully from her bed to the armchair by the window, her steps small, her breath shallow. I took care of her, though she never asked. I made her tea each morning, 2 sugars, 1 slice of lemon, the way she liked it. She still found ways to comment, of course. The water's too hot. The lemon's too thick. But her words didn't cut anymore. They sounded tired, like echoes from another life. Tom spent more time with her now. Sometimes I'd stand in the hallway and listen as they talked about old memories, his father, his childhood, the summer trips to Michigan. Evelyn's voice softened when she spoke to him, the sharp edges worn away by time. Once I heard her say, "You married a good woman, Tom." Better than I was to her. He didn't know I was there, and maybe she didn't know I was listening. But I heard it, and it stayed with me. At the library, my reading circle had grown into a weekly ritual. We now met in the community room, surrounded by folding chairs and chipped coffee mugs. Women came early to share stories before the session began. Stories of widowhood, betrayal, late-life heartbreak. But they also spoke of renewal of gardens, planted grandchildren, born friendships, rekindled after years of silence. One Thursday evening after the meeting, Mrs. Green squeezed my hand and said, "You've become our storyteller, Margaret. You speak for the women who never got to." Her words filled a space inside me I didn't realize was still empty. For years, I'd been quiet because I thought silence was safer. Now my voice had purpose, not to hurt, not to avenge, but to heal. Evelyn grew more fragile with each passing week. The doctors recommended an assisted living home somewhere she could be monitored and cared for. Tom resisted at first, guilt, I think, but Evelyn herself surprised us both. "I think it's time," she said, one evening, her eyes on the fading light outside the window. "I don't want to die surrounded by tension." Her words were simple, but they pierced something in me. Not pity, understanding. The night before she moved, I sat beside her bed. The house was quiet, except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the rain tapping against the roof. She looked at me and said, "You remind me of my mother. She didn't take nonsense from anyone either." I smiled faintly. "Maybe that's a compliment." "It is," she whispered. Then after a long pause, "I'm sorry, Margaret, for everything." For a moment I couldn't breathe, not because of the words themselves, but because I hadn't expected to hear them at all. I reached for her hand, fragile and cold in mine. "You don't have to apologize," I said quietly. "We both did what we knew." She nodded, tears glistening in the corners of her eyes. We sat like that for a long time. No accusations, no defenses, just two women finally laying down their weapons. When the moving van arrived the next morning, Evelyn wore her favorite lavender sweater. She stood by the door, frail but proud, as if she wanted to leave this house on her own terms. Before she left, she turned to me. "Keep those pants," she said softly. "They suit you now." Then she smiled a real smile, warm and almost shy, and walked out. Tom wrapped his arms around me after she was gone. "She meant that," he said. "I know," I whispered, and I meant what I said too. Weeks turned into months. I visited Evelyn every Sunday afternoon. We'd sit in the courtyard of the assisted living home surrounded by flowers tended by other residents. She liked to talk about her garden, about how she missed the smell of tomatoes in the soil. Sometimes when the sun was bright, she'd close her eyes and say, "It's peaceful here." One afternoon, she asked about my reading circle. "I heard you're helping other women tell their stories," she said. I nodded. "We all have something worth saying." She smiled faintly. "Maybe I'll come listen one day." It was the closest she ever came to saying she was proud. When summer rolled into autumn, Evelyn passed away quietly in her sleep. The nurses said she looked peaceful, her hands folded over her chest, her lavender sweater draped neatly around her shoulders. At her funeral, Tom wept softly. I held his hand, feeling both sorrow and release. After the service, I went home alone and opened my drawer. The mended pants were still there, faded soft but whole. I folded them carefully and placed them on top of the dresser, this time in the open. No shame, no memory of ridicule. Just gratitude for what they had taught me. That evening, I recorded a new story for my reading circle, one I called The Seam That Held. I told them about a woman who was torn down but refused to stay broken. A woman who learned that sometimes revenge isn't about making others suffer. It's about reclaiming your peace. When I finished, there was silence in the room. Then Mrs. Green, with tears in her eyes, whispered, "That story's about you, isn't it?" I smiled, maybe a little. A few months after Evelyn's passing, autumn settled gently over Indiana. The trees outside the library blazed gold and crimson, their leaves drifting across the parking lot like tiny endings that didn't hurt anymore. Life had quieted. There were no sharp voices echoing through my kitchen, no eggshells underfoot, no cold tension in the mornings. The house finally breathed, and so did I. But peace, I learned, isn't the absence of noise, it's the presence of understanding. I still worked at the library 3 days a week. The Life Stories Circle had doubled in size, and we now met in the church basement across town because the library couldn't hold us anymore. Every week, women shared pieces of themselves, the betrayals, the lessons, the forgiveness they never thought possible. And every week I saw something familiar in their eyes, the same flicker of power that once lit inside me. One evening, after the group finished, a woman named Clara, a widow with silver curls and a laugh like honey, came up to me. She held my hand and said, "I used to hate my daughter-in-law. I don't anymore. I see now I was the Evelyn in my story." I smiled gently. "Then you've already mended your seam." She didn't understand the metaphor, not right away, but she smiled anyway. And in that small moment, I knew Evelyn's legacy didn't end with pain. It became something else, perspective. At home, I made small changes. I repainted the kitchen pale blue instead of the harsh white Evelyn loved. I replaced her lace curtains with simple linen ones that let the light in. And I kept the garden alive, even her roses. Though I trimmed them back, reshaped them, gave them space to grow. Tom helped when he could. Our marriage was quiet now, cautious at times, but there was tenderness again, the kind that doesn't need words. Some evenings, we'd sit on the porch and watch the sunset, our hands resting close, but not touching. We were learning each other all over again, maybe for the first time. One Sunday, I found an old photograph in a box Evelyn had left behind. It was her wedding day. She looked young, nervous, but happy. On the back, in faded handwriting, it said, "For better or worse, we endure." I held the picture for a long time. That was her truth, not mine. I didn't want to endure anymore. I wanted to live. The next Thursday at the Circle, I decided to share something new. Not a poem, not a quote, but my own story, the full one this time. I told them about the torn pants, the humiliation, the years of silence. I told them about the day I spoke up and the strange, quiet freedom that came after. When I said, "Put them on and feel my pain," a few women gasped softly. Others nodded, eyes wet, because they understood. They'd had their own pants, their own moments of being made to feel small, and the slow, patient mending that followed. When I finished, the room was still. Then someone began to clap softly at first, then louder. And for a moment, I thought this must be what healing sounds like. After the meeting, Mrs. Green hugged me. "You should write that down, dear," she said. "Your story could help so many others." I smiled. It already has. That night, I walked home under the amber streetlights, the air crisp and cool. When I opened my door, the house smelled like cinnamon again, my cinnamon, not Evelyn's perfume. I lit a single candle on the kitchen table and placed the mended pants beside it. I didn't need to wear them anymore. They had done their job, they had carried my story. As the candle flickered, I thought about everything those pants represented: pain, patience, power, but also forgiveness, the quiet kind that asks for nothing in return. I realized that revenge, at least the way I once imagined it, was too small a word. What I found was larger a freedom that didn't need to hurt anyone else to exist. It was peace earned through endurance and compassion, born from scars. I thought of Evelyn and hoped she had found her peace too. The next morning, I started something new. I opened a small podcast with help from the library. We called it Her Story, Her Strength. Each week, I recorded one woman's real-life story of pain and resilience. Sometimes I shared my own. The first episode I uploaded was titled, "Your Pants Are Torn." Within days, people from all over the state began writing letters. Older women, widows, mothers, even granddaughters, all saying the same thing. I thought I was the only one. And that's when I knew the story wasn't mine anymore. It belonged to every woman who had ever been torn, stitched, and made stronger for it. I ended that first episode with the same words I'll say to you now. If someone once made you feel small, don't waste your life waiting for their apology. Mend what they tore. Stand tall. And when you're ready, tell your story. Because somewhere, another woman is waiting to hear it. So if my voice found you tonight, I hope it stays with you. I hope it reminds you that broken things can be beautiful again, including us. And if this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to remember that healing is its own kind of revenge. Thank you for listening. Until next time.